You will be shocked when you find out what Native Americans used to eat. Now I will tell you about 10 forgotten Native American foods that will feed you in the wild. Modern supermarkets have convinced us that food grows on shelves, packaged in plastic. We have forgotten that for thousands of years, people found everything they needed to live right at their feet. The indigenous peoples of North America had a deep knowledge of the plant world, which was both their home and their source of sustenance. They saw not just a forest or a prairie, but a veritable pantry full of nutritious roots, grains, and berries. This knowledge allowed them to survive in the harshest conditions, where modern humans would not last more than a few days. Much of this knowledge has been lost or forgotten today. We will follow in the footsteps of the hunters and gatherers of the Great Plains and Eastern Woods to rediscover their diet. This is not just a list of plants, but the key to understanding a whole philosophy of living in harmony with nature. Watch the video to the end and you will learn how one marsh plant could replace an entire grocery store. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival in the wild, which is hidden in plain sight. Cattail, which many consider to be a common weed, was one of the most valuable and versatile plants for Native Americans. It provided food all year round, and almost every part of it was edible at a certain stage of growth. In the spring, young cattail shoots were cut at the base. Their taste and texture resembled cucumbers or young bamboo. They were eaten raw, added to salads, or cooked like asparagus. In summer, the plant produced two types of inflorescences. The male ones, located at the top of the stem, were rich in pollen. It was collected by shaking it into bags and then used as flour, added to baked goods to give them a golden color and nutritional value. The female inflorescences, future dark brown cobs, were also eaten when young and green. They were boiled and eaten like corn. It was a seasonal delicacy, available only for a short period of time. In autumn and winter, it was time for the main treasure of cattail, its rhizomes. Thick, starchy roots were dug out of the muddy bottom. It was hard work, but the reward was worth it. Flour was extracted from the rhizomes. They were cleaned, dried, and then ground into powder. This flour was the basis for flatbread, soups, and stews, sustaining people during the hungriest winter months. The core of the rhizome could also be eaten boiled or baked. It tasted similar to potatoes. It was a reliable source of carbohydrates, available even when the ground was covered with snow. The stems of cattail were also used. Closer to the base, they have a tender white core. It could be eaten raw or cooked and was available almost any time of the year. Thus, cattail was a complete food source. It provided vegetables in the spring, flour and corn in the summer, and potatoes in the winter. Knowledge of this one plant could save the life of a lost traveler. Cattail is a striking example of how much useful stuff we have stopped noticing around us. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how our perception of wild plants has changed? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the food that millions of people trample underfoot? For many tribes, especially in the eastern forest regions, acorns were as basic a food as wheat or rice is for us today. They were incredibly nutritious, rich in fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, but they hid one secret. Raw acorns contain large amounts of tannins, bitter substances that make them inedible. Therefore, the main task was to process them to get rid of the bitterness. This process required patience and knowledge passed down from generation to generation. First, the collected acorns were dried. Then they were shelled and ground into flour. It was at this stage that the most important process began: leaching. There were several ways to remove tannins. One of the most common was washing with cold water. The acorn flour was placed in a porous basket and repeatedly poured over with cold water, which gradually washed away the bitterness. Another method involved burying whole acorns in marshy soil for several months. The mud and water naturally extracted the tannins. After that, the acorns were dug up and were ready for consumption. After leaching, the flour acquired a pleasant, sweetish taste. It was used to cook porridge and soups, which resembled oatmeal in consistency. It was a filling and warming food. Acorn flour was also used to bake bread. It was mixed with water, formed into flat cakes, and baked on hot stones or in the ashes of a fire. This bread was dense and very nutritious, Some tribes cooked thick soups or stews from processed acorns, adding berries and other edible plants. This dish could be stored for some time and was an important part of the diet. The process of harvesting acorns was long and laborious, but it provided the tribe with a reliable food supply for the entire winter. Oak forests were, in essence, huge plantations that provided a stable harvest. The ability to turn bitter acorns into nutritious bread is the pinnacle of the culinary ingenuity of indigenous peoples. But what if I told you that the most coveted root could hide a deadly danger? In the next chapter, you will learn about a plant that required not only a shovel to harvest, but also the deepest knowledge. A secret passed down from generation to generation is the ability to distinguish edible plants from their dangerous counterparts. Camas bulbs were a real delicacy for the tribes of the Great Plains in the West and an important commodity for trade. Fields covered with blue camas flowers were considered a real treasure. The bulbs of this plant are rich in inulin, a complex carbohydrate that turns into sweet fructose when cooked. This made camas not only nutritious but also very tasty. Its sweet taste was reminiscent of baked pears or sweet potatoes. Gathering the bulbs was a collective activity, most often carried out by women. Armed with special digging sticks, the women went to the meadows after the flowering season ended. After several weeks of hard work, they were able to gather enough to last the whole year. The most important stage was preparation. Raw bulbs would be too difficult to digest. Therefore, they were cooked in earthen ovens for several days. To do this, they dug a large pit and lined the bottom with hot stones. They placed a layer of damp grass on top of the stones, then the camas bulbs, another layer of grass, and covered everything with earth. The bulbs slowly simmered in this steam bath for 1 to 3 days. As a result of this treatment, they became soft, dark, and very sweet. They were eaten immediately as a festive dish. It was a real feast after long labor. Some of the prepared bulbs were dried in the sun. When dried, they could be stored for a very long time. They were ground into flour or stored whole for use during the winter. Dried camas was added to soups and the stews as a sweetener and thickener. The flour from it was used to make small flatbreads. It was a valuable source of energy during the cold season. However, camas had an insidious doppelganger, the so-called deadly camas. Its white flowers and bulbs were very similar to the edible plant. Mistaking one for the other could have dire consequences, so knowledge of the differences between these plants was worth its weight in gold. The ability to properly harvest and prepare camas was a vital skill. It demonstrates how deeply indigenous peoples understood nature. Their knowledge was their main protection and source of prosperity. What if everything you were taught about rice is not true? Wild rice, or Echinocloa cruscali, is not actually rice. It is the seed of a tall aquatic grass that grows in the shallow waters of lakes and rivers in the Great Lakes region and surrounding areas. For the Ojibwe, Menominee, and other peoples of the region, this plant was a sacred gift and the foundation of their culture and economy. Their entire way of life was closely tied to the annual cycle of wild rice growth and harvest. The harvesting process was a true ritual. The rice was usually harvested in pairs, slowly moving through the thick vegetation in a canoe. One person steered the boat, while the other used 2 sticks, called beaters, to gently tilt the stalks over the side and knock the ripe grains into the canoe with a light tap. This method allowed only the ripest seeds to be harvested. Some of the grains fell into the water, ensuring a harvest for the following year. It was an example of sustainable and careful use of natural resources. After harvesting, the processing began, which also required considerable effort. First, the rice was dried in the sun or over a slow fire. Drying not only preserved the grain, but also gave it a characteristic smoky aroma. Then the rice had to be threshed. That is, the husks had to be separated from the kernels. To do this, a small pit was dug, lined with skin, and the dried grains were poured into it. A person wearing special shoes carefully trampled on the rice, rubbing off the husks. After that, the rice was winnowed in the wind. It was tossed on a large flat dish or piece of bark. The wind carried away the light husks, and the heavy, clean grains fell back. The finished wild rice was cooked as porridge, added to soups, or served with other dishes. It had a rich, nutty flavor and was much more nutritious than its Asian counterpart. It is rich in protein, fiber, and vitamins, Wild rice reserves allowed tribes to comfortably survive long and harsh winters. It was not just food, but a symbol of prosperity and the basis of life. Control over rice lakes was vital. Today, wild rice is considered a delicacy, but for indigenous peoples, it was and remains their daily bread. In the next chapter, you will learn about a root that Europeans mistook for a completely different vegetable. Jerusalem artichoke, also known as sunroot or sunchoke, is a close relative of the sunflower. It is a tall plant with bright yellow flowers, but its main value is hidden underground. Native Americans have been growing and harvesting its edible tubers for centuries. Jerusalem artichoke tubers resemble ginger root or small potatoes in appearance. They are very hardy and can easily withstand winter frosts while remaining in the ground. This made them a reliable source of food available in late fall and early spring. Unlike potatoes, Jerusalem artichokes do not contain starch. Instead, the tubers accumulate inulin, which gives them a sweet taste. This taste becomes even more pronounced after the first frost. Native Americans used Jerusalem artichokes in a variety of ways. They ate them raw, cut into thin slices. When raw, it is crunchy and juicy, with a nutty flavor reminiscent of water chestnuts. Most often, the tubers were cooked. They were boiled, baked in the ashes of a fire, or roasted on hot stones. When cooked, Jerusalem artichokes became soft and resembled baked potatoes in texture. Jerusalem artichokes were also used to make soups and stews. They were combined with other vegetables, grains, and meat. The sweet taste of the tubers enriched the flavor of any dish. This plant was so widespread and valued that it was cultivated throughout eastern North America. Tribes created entire fields of Jerusalem artichokes. It was an important part of their agriculture. European colonists quickly appreciated the merits of this plant. They adopted the culture of its cultivation and use from the Indians. This is how Jerusalem artichoke came to Europe, where it was given the name Jerusalem artichoke. Its ease of cultivation and high yield made Jerusalem artichoke very attractive. It did not require special care and could grow in almost any soil. It was a real find for food security. Today, Jerusalem artichoke is gaining popularity again thanks to its beneficial properties. But it is important to remember that we owe this plant to the knowledge and labor of indigenous peoples. They were the first to see the treasure hidden in the roots of the earth apple. I discovered this by accident while studying the way of life of nomadic tribes, and I was amazed. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other peoples of the Great Plains, prairie turnip, or timsula, was one of the most important foods. This humble root, hidden underground, was the equivalent of bread for them. Prairie turnip is not actually a turnip. It is a starchy, spindle-shaped root of a plant from the legume family. Only people with a trained eye could find it in the endless prairie, guided by its inconspicuous leaves and flowers. Harvesting turnips was an important summer activity. Women used sharpened sticks to dig the roots out of the hard, dry ground. It was painstaking work under the scorching sun, but it ensured the tribe's survival. Fresh turnips could be boiled or baked in coals. The taste was somewhere between a potato and a turnip. It was a filling and nutritious side dish. But the main advantage of prairie turnips was their ability to be stored for long periods of time. Most of the harvest was stored for future use. To do this, the roots were peeled and cut into thin slices. Then these slices were strung on ropes and dried in the sun. When dried, the turnip became hard as a rock and could be stored for years without losing its nutritional properties. It was a strategic reserve in case of a hungry winter or unsuccessful hunting. Dried turnips were used to make flour. They were ground into powder and used as a thickener for soups and stews. This flour made dishes more filling and gave them a pleasant taste. The nomads of the Great Plains always took supplies of dried turnips with them. It was light, compact, and very nutritious, the ideal food for long journeys. It could simply be nibbled on the go to maintain strength. Prairie turnips were not just food. They were part of the culture and economy of the Plains tribes. Places rich in this plant were highly valued. This humble root was a real lifesaver in the harsh conditions of the prairies, where other sources of plant food were rare. Now let's move on from nutritious roots to something sweet. In the next chapter, you will learn how Native Americans obtained sugar long before the arrival of sugarcane. Long before cane sugar arrived in North America, the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands already had their own natural sweetener. They were the first to discover the amazing property of the sugar maple, its sweet sap. Maple sugar production was an important seasonal industry. The process began in early spring, when the days were getting warm and the nights were still cold. This temperature difference caused the sap to flow actively through the tree trunk. The Indians called this time the sugar moon. Using an axe or knife, a V-shaped cut was made in the trunk of the maple tree. A wooden trough or piece of bark was inserted into the lower part of the cut. The sap flowed down this trough into a container, usually made of birch bark. The collected maple sap was not very sweet and resembled water in consistency. To turn it into sugar, it was necessary to evaporate the excess moisture. This process required a large amount of firewood and patience. The Indians evaporated the sap in clay or wooden troughs. Since such containers could not be placed directly on the fire, they used the hot stone method. Stones heated in a fire were lowered into the trough with the sap, and it began to boil. As the water boiled away, the juice turned into a thick syrup. If the process was continued, the syrup crystallized. The result was hard maple sugar. It was poured into special molds where it solidified into cones or blocks. In this solid form, the sugar could be stored for a very long time. It was a valuable product for personal consumption and trade. Maple sugar was used everywhere. It was added to porridge and drinks, used to preserve berries and to flavor meat dishes. It was the only sweetener available. It was not only a delicacy, but also an important source of energy. Hunters and warriors took pieces of maple sugar with them on long trips. It helped them quickly regain their strength. Maple sugar production was a family or community affair. People set up temporary camps right in the maple groves. It was a time of hard work, but also a time of celebration and socializing. On a hot summer day, there is nothing better than a refreshing drink with a hint of tartness. Native Americans knew where to find a natural source of this tartness. It was sumac, a shrub with bright, fluffy, ruby-colored fruit clusters. Sumac berries, which look like small velvety cones, are covered with tiny hairs. These hairs contain malic acid, which gives them their characteristic tart, sour taste. It was these berries that formed the basis of the traditional drink. They were harvested at the end of summer when they reached maximum ripeness and brightness. It was important to do this before heavy rains. Rain could wash away the valuable sour pollen from the fruit. The preparation of the drink was very simple. The harvested fruit clusters were placed in a container with cold water. Hot water was not used, as it could release bitter tannins from the plant. The fruit was gently kneaded by hand directly in the water to help the acid dissolve. After a while, the water took on a pinkish hue and a pleasant sour taste. This process was similar to brewing cold tea. The drink was then strained through a cloth or a bunch of grass. This was necessary to separate the liquid from the small hairs that could cause irritation. The result was a refreshing drink similar to lemonade or fruit juice. It was drunk to quench thirst in hot weather. It was not only delicious, but also healthy. Sumac is rich in vitamin C, which made the drink an excellent way to maintain good health. Sometimes maple sugar was added to Indian lemonade. This balanced the acidity and made the taste more pleasant. The result was a real summer cocktail. In addition to the drink, dried and ground sumac berries were used as a seasoning. This sour powder was added to soups and meat dishes. It served the same purpose as lemon juice or vinegar in modern cooking. Sumac is another example of how indigenous peoples skillfully use the gifts of the nature around them. They found flavor and benefit even in plants that many today consider simply part of the landscape. Burdock, or burdock root, is known today mainly for its clinging inflorescences, which inspired the creation of Velcro fasteners. However, for Native Americans and later for European settlers, this plant was primarily a valuable source of food. Its long, fleshy root was eaten. The roots of the first-year plant are considered the most delicious and tender. In the second year, the root becomes tough and woody as all the energy goes into flowering. Therefore, it was important to know which plant to dig up. Harvesting burdock roots is no easy task. Its taproot can go as deep as 1 meter into the ground. It took both strength and skill to extract it whole without damaging it. Before cooking, the root was thoroughly cleaned of soil and dark outer skin. Underneath was white or cream-colored flesh. The cleaned root quickly darkens in the air, so it was immediately immersed in water. The taste and texture of burdock root are unique. It is slightly sweet, with an earthy flavor vaguely reminiscent of artichoke. It was prepared in the same way as other root vegetables. Most often, burdock root was boiled. It was cut into pieces and boiled in salted water until soft. The boiled root could be eaten as a separate dish or added to stews. It could also be baked or fried. When fried in fat, burdock root acquired a pleasant, crispy crust. It was a hearty and nutritious food, rich in carbohydrates. Young burdock leaves and stems are also edible in the spring. They had to be picked before they became tough and bitter. The stems were peeled and cooked like asparagus. Burdock was not only food, but also an important medicinal plant. Decoctions from its root were used to treat various ailments. It was a versatile plant, beneficial from top to bottom. Although burdock is rarely found on the dinner table today, in some cuisines around the world, such as Japanese, it is still a popular vegetable. This proves that the Native Americans' knowledge of this plant was absolutely correct. Amaranth, or pigweed, with its bright panicles of flowers, is often perceived as an aggressive weed. However, for many indigenous peoples throughout America, it was one of the main grain crops. It was cultivated and valued on a par with corn. The main value of amaranth lies in its tiny seeds. A single plant can produce tens of thousands of seeds, making it incredibly productive. These seeds are a veritable storehouse of nutrients. Amaranth seeds are rich in high-quality protein that contains all the essential amino acids. This made it especially important in regions where other sources of protein were limited. In terms of nutritional value, it surpasses many modern grains. Harvesting the seeds required a certain amount of skill. The inflorescences were cut when the seeds began to ripen and laid out to dry. Then the dry inflorescences were threshed to separate the small grains. After that, the seeds had to be sifted to clean them of debris. This was painstaking work because of the very small size of the seeds. The clean grains were ready for consumption. Small flat cakes were baked from amaranth flour. The seeds were also boiled to make a porridge similar in consistency to couscous. This porridge was filling and easily digestible. One of the most interesting ways to prepare it was to create puffed amaranth. The seeds were thrown onto a hot surface, such as a hot flat stone. The heat caused them to pop and swell, turning them into something like miniature popcorn. This airy amaranth was eaten on its own, or mixed with maple syrup or honey. This mixture was used to make nutritious bars. It was both a treat and a high-energy food for long journeys. Young amaranth leaves are also edible. They were picked in the spring and cooked like spinach. They are rich in vitamins and minerals. Although amaranth was undeservedly forgotten and replaced by other crops with the arrival of Europeans, today it is experiencing a renaissance. Modern science has confirmed its unique nutritional value. This ancient plant is once again ready to feed people, just as it did thousands of years ago. We have touched on only a small part of the vast heritage of knowledge of the indigenous peoples of North America. Every plant in their world had its purpose, its history, and its role in sustaining life. For them, the forests and prairies were not wild nature, but a home full of friends and helpers. These forgotten foods are not just exotic delicacies or recipes for survival. They are a reminder that nature can give us everything we need if we treat it with respect and understanding. It is a lesson in harmony that is more important today than ever before. By studying these ancient traditions, we can not only diversify our diet, but also learn to see the world differently. Perhaps the next time you walk through a park or forest, you will look at familiar plants with completely different eyes. What do you think about these forgotten foods? Which one would you try first? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.